So I'll just kind of briefly read through, I hope you can read my handwriting, the Dark Ages. So that's kind of the subject, kind of the category, so that I can find it later. The Dark Ages are the church's fault. So somebody might say that. That's kind of an objection. Try and boil it down to where somebody is actually bearing the burden of proof. Remember we talked about last week, bearing the burden of proof. If somebody just says something like, oh, we'll just look at the Dark Ages. What are you saying about the Dark Ages? Boil it down to, and often they say that and you know what they're thinking, but in this, what is the actual thing they're saying? Okay, the Dark Ages are the church's fault. The next thing we're going to look at is the Dark Ages were science versus religion, so that would be a separate page, okay? But the Dark Ages are the church's fault. So it doesn't take much history, and we're going to talk about this next week, but to see that the early Middle Ages, 500 to 1000, resulted from the fall of Rome, which was not the church's fault, okay? So we'll talk about this next week, but I'm just kind of showing you this is how you might respond to that, and in fact the church saved Western culture in many ways. Support, how would I prove that? Universities' great art advances in technology were made during the Middle Ages through the church and the universities. The church preserved classical texts. Free thought was encouraged during this time, so we'll talk about that next week. Here's some books and resources I might go to if somebody is interested in more help. And then counter objections and further study. Keep it really concise here, okay? Somebody might talk for an hour about this, but what are kind of the major headings that this would go off of? And these might lead into like another page, another Q&A paper, as it did for me. What about Galileo? And so the next paper that I wrote here was Galileo proves that the church suppressed science in the Dark Ages. So that's on the back here. And so for me, I'm kind of working through the objections that people might have in kind of a conversation and how I would prove that. For you, I had asked you to do one Q&A per class. If you want to do what I'm doing, go ahead. Just don't do all 10 on like one subject. Just try and diversify a little bit, but I'll give you freedom to do what is really helpful for you. The reason I said that is I know a few of us have a narrow specialty of apologetics, and you might come to class and be like, boom, I'm going to talk about creation science and fill out 10 on creation science without doing any fresh research or fresh thought. So I just want you to break new ground if possible. But I'll leave that to you. I'll lift the restriction of having to do one per class. Just do it on subjects that are helpful to you.
Even thinking of how you supported this, like I wouldn't have been able to answer that. I'm like,
yeah, well, you will after next class.
Okay.
You will after next class. You might be struggling to fill these out because we haven't actually covered any material yet. We're just laying the foundation. And even after today, even after today, you're not really going to have a lot of material for a Q&A. Starting next week, you're going to have tons and tons of information. So, and actually the Q&A are going to start being due next week. So one is due next week. Sorry, there's not tons of material to use. If you're really struggling, let me know. But you can do it on anything. There must be something you can prove.
I don't know.
All right. Is this clear?
Yes.
You guys got that? Okay, good.
Oh, but I wouldn't.
Yeah, I mean, don't be. I mean, obviously, I'm the teacher, right? Like, don't worry if you can't support it as well as I did here. But yeah, just in your own words, in a way that's gonna be helpful to you. Let's pick it up from last week. We were talking about. I felt like we didn't really have enough time to talk about everything I want to talk about last week. Next time I teach this class, I'm going to divide the syllabus and the introduction a little bit. We talked about the dangers of apologetics, and that's where I want to come back to, is to say apologetics is potentially a very dangerous thing. And we talked about how you need to be ready to bite the bullet and say the gospel is foolishness on this point. There's always going to be a place in culture where you can share the gospel, you can make sense, you're speaking the language of culture, and then you get to a certain issue, and on this issue our culture is just like, whoa, we can't go there. And at some point, you need to be prepared to make that step. And you need to be able to stick your neck out. And what are some of the issues in our culture, the major stumbling blocks to faith in Christ? Abortion, homosexuality, euthanasia. So as we're trying to make the gospel make sense to people, we can't compromise our faith and be like, I mean, abortion might not be the first thing we talk about, but at some point we need to, be true, sanctify Christ as Lord in our hearts and say, at the end of the day, Christ is still Lord in my heart, not culture. And if we don't do that, we are compromising our faith and we're compromising the Lord. I see you're kind of dodging around this thing. I'm going to move it over here.
Oh, I think it's on Don't Tilt.
Oh, really?
Yeah, so I was watching it on Facebook and it's on the side.
How do we change this?
Drag up from the bottom, or from the bottom.
From the other bottom?
Yeah. And it should have like a
Yeah.
don't rotate.
The don't rotate thing. No, it's not on.
Okay.
Why don't you work?
We had this on YouTube.
Let's, is it looking?
Oh no, it's still on the side.
Okay.
So if you flip it up, then
I'm just redoing it, okay?
yeah,
I tried to find it, I couldn't.
I don't know if we did. Did we do it last week?
we recorded it all. This is a live feed.
Live feed?
So you're
public.
going to be able to watch. If you're on Facebook, you can watch this.
Oh, shoot. How do I do this?
Plus, it's being recorded.
Go live.
With good sound.
So if we... Is this better?
Let me see.
So that what you're saying is that in the end, our argument for many of these issues is not that it's natural or the way that it should be or anything, but that it's because God said so, right? That this is what God wants, and therefore that is our reason. I mean, I've heard a lot of people spend time in apologetics trying to say, well, go down the road of homosexuality is wrong because it's not natural, and then finding all these reasons why this is sort of bad for you as an individual, when in fact...
Is it still sideways?
Yeah.
It's just that God has said it's wrong. So
I'll just
it's
do
wrong.
this.
Am I wrong?
That's a very important division between natural science, natural theology, and I'm not sure what the other one's called. Unnatural theology. That's not what it's called. This thing can tilt somehow. I'm sure of it. Yeah, that's how.
There we go.
Unfortunately, they'll still have a portrait view online, but whatever, be that as it may.
Oh, okay.
So let's talk about Revelation. This isn't in your notes, but it's a good foundational thing to talk about. We believe in the God who reveals himself. Actually, we're going to get here for sure. When we talk about Revelation, it's very closely tied to mystery. The biblical idea of mystery isn't smoke and mirrors, spookiness, weirdness. It's something that you couldn't know unless God revealed it to you. We could not know that God is Trinity unless God revealed it to us. We couldn't know, the things that even Jesus revealed to us on the Sermon on the Mount about loving your enemy, doing good to those that hate us. That's a leader that washes the feet of his disciples. That's so counter-cultural. So there's mysteries that God reveals to us, and there's two ways that God reveals them to us, and one is through the Bible, and this is what we call special revelation. And the other way that God reveals himself is through nature. I'm just going to draw a world here. And this is what we could call natural theology or science. Those are two separate things, but very closely related. Understanding God through the world. So what sort of things can we know through the natural world about God? What things has he revealed to us through the world?
Really smart.
That he's really smart.
Like, just even our DNA is
It's incredible, right?
Yeah.
What sort of things can we only learn through the Bible? That Jesus dies and rose again from our sins. We can, if we go further than this, we can figure out that we're sinners, that we need grace from natural revelation, because we all kind of have this general sense of what is right and wrong. We know that we don't live up to it. But the solution to the problem is from special revelation. We can't know, how to be saved just from sitting on a rock and contemplating. We need Jesus to reveal himself, because we're saved through a person, through Jesus Christ. Let me tilt this down a little bit.
Unscrew that, yeah.
Okay, that would be better. So talking about, we can do apologetics in both ways, right? And this always needs to be our foundation. When there's a conflict between the two, and there's often a conflict between the two, we come back and we say, yes, but God revealed this to me, right? But there is a time and a place to say, well, what does science actually say, right? So, homosexuality, there's a whole thing to talk about, because, and the way that we could put it is to say, this is my belief. I believe this. But science will oppose this and try, or people will use scientific reasons to say this is wrong. And I can use counter-science to say, or I can also use scientific answers to say, no, what you're saying is wrong, and I'm going to stick over here. Okay? So, many people would say homosexuality, this is something I've researched a lot, but I don't know if I'm ever going to publish it or whatever, but, homosexuality is natural, and Christianity is wrong because it says that it's a sin. Well, there's a lot of psychological research that says, well, actually, it's hard to generalize, it's a huge issue, but a lot of people, it's a gender dysphoria is an actual psychological condition, sometimes arising from something in childhood, either abuse or an issue, and for some people it can even get to the point of personality disorder, that they are confused about who they are as a person, and that's a known condition. And the counter-objection would be, well, are you trying to say that all homosexuals are like that? No, that's not what I'm saying, but there's more complexity to the issue. So you can go back and forth using science without it being the foundation. This is still the foundation over here. But if you're bringing this scientific objection, well, let's talk about what the science actually says about that. Let's talk about what the statistics are. Life expectancy. Many statistics say homosexuality cuts life expectancy by up to 20 years. So, that's a factor. That's a scientific factor that isn't from scriptures, although there's some verses that talk about something like that. So I'm getting very sidetracked, but that is a very good question. And this is actually going to be very helpful as we go forward and talk about worldview. All right. Let's move forward and talk about what is a worldview. What is this?
Marker.
How do you know it's a marker?
Someone told us.
Frame of reference.
Frame of reference. You guys have all read the notes, right? Excellent. Okay. Not you. Okay. When we look at something, how do you perceive this marker over here? How do you know what I'm even talking about?
You look at it.
Yeah, so as you see something in the world, you're using your five senses to to apprehend this, to figure out what this is. But your sensory perception alone is not enough to tell you what the marker is it? If this was the first time you saw this, you wouldn't know what it is. So we have, you have an image in your mind of what you're seeing, and it's your worldview that enables you to make sense of what you're seeing. Does that make sense? When you look at this marker, close your eyes and you can visualize the marker. It's up here. It's different than the marker itself. You have an image in your head of what the marker is. And the image you're going to have is going to be influenced by what? Give me some examples of things that will influence how you see the world. Past experience. Study. Knowledge. Parents.
Friends.
By seeing it.
Socialization.
A past experience of seeing something similar. You guys likely haven't seen a specific exact marker before, but you've seen ones that are similar, right? How you were socialized, your religious views, how rich you are, your socio-economic status, where you were born in the world. All these things influence how we see the world, right?
Wouldn't kind of seeing one kind of already encapsulate all of them?
That's a presupposition.
Okay.
That comes from your worldview. To say if I've seen one marker, I've seen them all.
Well, okay.
So that is a way that you're organizing what you're seeing. That's the way that you're organizing what you're seeing. And that is, I just used the word presupposition. Presupposition is a fancy way of saying assumption. We approach the world with all sorts of assumptions, and there's what's the saying? Assumptions make. I wanted somebody else to say it, not me. But okay, that is true. But we could not function in the world without assumptions. If we were like a brand, like I just had a new little kid. He's so cute, and he looks at the world kind of with these big saucer eyes. And he's got the sensory perception. Everything is hooked up. His ears work, his eyes work, his nose work, his tongue works, and his feeling and whatever. But he can't put it in. He doesn't know he doesn't understand it yet. He's just like, he's. A few weeks ago, I said, the facial recognition software has been installed. Because before that, he's just kind of, they're in a fog, and then all of a sudden, there's a face, and they connect to faces, and from there, they start figuring out their worldview and how the world makes sense and how it works. Cool. On page 31 of your new notes, the way that this is often explained is to say our worldview is like a set of glasses through which we see the world. And this is good so long as you understand that the glasses are not in our sensory perception. Okay? The glasses don't belong here on the diagram, they belong up here. It's not how you see the world, it's how you understand the world and how you make sense of it. But practically speaking, we see the world through our worldview. And I mean, to take this to the extreme, if you went to Papua New Guinea, went to one of the few tribes that has not yet seen Western civilization, and you showed them this marker, they would have their sensory perception would be identical to ours, unless they had bad eyesight or something and didn't have glasses. But their sensory perception would be the same. But what they would understand would be extremely different, right? Because of their worldview. Do you guys understand worldview? Okay. Worldviews can be better or worse. No, you can't say that today. You can't say that. Yes, I'm going to say it.
It just went out on the live stream.
Just went on the live stream. Oh no, what are we going to do? Okay. You can have worldviews that are bad, that hold society back, that keep people stuck, I'll use this expression, in the dark ages, just because we'll talk about that next week. I'm going to talk about 5 basic worldviews, but mostly we're going to talk about 3. But I'm going to talk about polytheism, And in here we can include polytheism, spiritism, animism, Hinduism. If we were doing a more thorough class, I would divide between those, but those are close enough, we're just going to put them under polytheism. Then we're going to talk about our good friend Plato. And I'm going to make the claim that Platonism is better than polytheism. And then I'm going to talk about pre-modernity. Well, maybe I should just talk about pre-modern.
So do we actually have a scale going on here where the bottom is worse and
Yeah,
the top
yeah.
is better?
Yeah, sorry, that maybe isn't clear in this little graph I made. So we have polytheism, Platonism, pre-modern, and I would say that pre-modern is the best system there is. This is the way people thought during the Dark Ages was the height of intellectual thought in world thinking. This is my view. During the Dark Ages. And I call it the Dark Ages just for that reason. And so the next class I'm going to have to explain how I can substantiate this, because apparently the Dark Ages people were very primitive and stupid. Then we have modernity. No, sorry, I don't need to put the ities on there. That's just turning it into a noun instead of an adjective. So pre-modern is an adjective, but we'll leave it like that. And then we have modern worldview. And then we have postmodern.
Just right down there with spiritism, animism.
It is a stupid way to think, okay? It is a very insufficient worldview. And I can say that with confidence because I was one, okay? And that's why I'll speak with a bit of energy. I wasted good years of my youth and life on postmodernity. But we'll get there when we get there. But right now I want to make the claim, or explain what I mean when I say that worldviews are better or worse than others. How can you judge? How can you say that one idea is better than the other? One way I could say that is that one is more true than the other, right? But that's going to get circular. True according to who? True according to me and my worldview. Okay, well that doesn't really work. That's circular reasoning. I'm going to say that it is helpful, that worldviews are more or less helpful for specific things, creating science and creating ethics. In a polytheistic system, you can have wisdom. Many polytheistic systems have a very wise approach to the world, a very wise approach to nature, just kind of a pragmatic, this works, this doesn't work. Okay? But it's hard to develop a scientific system to talk about how the world actually works when you're not sure why water is boiling. Is it boiling because Zeus is angry at you? Is it boiling because the water demons are fighting the fire demons? We don't know why it's boiling. Okay? We have a chaotic, crazy system. And so I'm going to make the argument, and we'll go through this, that Platonism is better because, for reasons that I'll explain. We need to have a fixed point of reference when we're talking about science. The world needs to be separate from us. It needs to be observable. It needs to be knowable so that we can have science. We're down here right now with postmodernity, and people think this way. I'll make the argument throughout this course. If we started here, we never would have had the scientific revolution. This way of thinking, I mean, if your view is your view and my view is my view, how can we progress with science? The whole, astrophysics and biology and chemistry, all this stuff moves forward because we think that the world is real and it's objective and it's out there and it's unchanging. And when I observe it, and when you observe it, we're seeing the same thing. This doesn't make sense in postmodernity. This doesn't exist in postmodernity. When you see something and I see something, we see something different. And so science shouldn't make sense in postmodernity. That's what I'm going to explain when we get there. So that's for science. That worldviews are better or worse based on their ability to produce science. Secondly, worldviews are better or worse based on their ability to produce ethics. It's because I printed on the back of the pages. That's why I'm lost. Just a really short section here, the bottom of 32. Why do we need objectivity in ethics? After all, there's lots of worldviews that have ethics without having a fixed point of reference. without having a God up in the heavens that says something is right or something is wrong? Absolutely. Your reading in the textbook is going to do a great job of talking about that this week, so have a good look at that. And then when we talk about the moral argument, we're going to talk a lot about this, so I'm just going to be brief here. But if we don't have a fixed point of reference, for example, God, or karma is another way of doing it, or some idea of a bigger power, you can't tell the king that he has sinned. And this is a serious problem. So Nathan the prophet was able to go into King David and say, you are not allowed to kill somebody and take his wife, even if you are king. And he said, I have sinned. And he submitted himself to that. And I was driving here listening to one of the Psalms. I think it was written by David, and he's agonizing about his sin, and God, I've sinned so much, and forgive me, and I'm such a sinner. And that only makes sense if there's a power higher than the king. Okay? Write this down. If there are no moral absolutes. There are no moral absolutes. Your opinion versus my opinion versus the opinion down the road versus Hinduism versus Buddhism. It's all personal opinion. There are no moral absolutes. Nothing is absolutely right. Nothing is absolutely wrong. This is what is taught at Bishop's. This is what is taught at the University of Sherbrooke. This is what is taught everywhere. There are no moral absolutes. Well, okay, maybe there are some classes that don't teach this exactly. But this is what is normal in our culture, is to teach. There are no moral absolutes. Nobody can tell me what to do. Then, might makes right. Who decides whose opinion wins? Usually in atheistic arguments, when you talk about this and you talk about, well, do you really think that all opinions are equal? What about rape? What about child abuse? What about, you go to these extreme examples and they're like, well, we have laws for that. Whoever has the biggest stick makes the rules.
Yeah.
If there's no moral absolutes, the might makes right. And in the pre-modern system, we had a way of making society where God speaks. And it's so simple that it's almost offensive to say, children, obey your parents in the Lord, for this is right. Pay your taxes to Caesar, because all the authority on earth has been established by God, and so honor God by honoring the king. And yet, when you build society with God at the top, then your first reaction to that is to say, well, that's putting too much authority in the hands of the king and of the parents, to say they've been appointed by God. Johnny, I have been appointed by God to be your parent. Therefore, clean your room. I don't want to clean my room. God says I'm in charge of you, so go clean your room. But if you don't have that, what it ends up with is, Johnny, clean your room. I don't want to clean my room. I'll hit you if you don't clean your room. Or in our society, I'll put you in the corner if you don't clean your room. I'll yell at you, whatever. I have the biggest stick right now, so shut up and go clean your room because I say so. I'm the final authority. And then they'll learn when they grow up, whoever has the biggest stick is the one that makes the rules. And we get confused by that because often the person that holds the biggest stick is not the person that's actually the leader today. Who are the people that hold the biggest sticks today? Not political power. I'm not talking about that.
Media.
Economic power, media power, terrorism, guns. How about social power, like social media? Being able to create a meme that gets shared and makes somebody look silly. That's tremendous amount, or shaming people. So we need to have a society where we're able to say there is absolute objective morality. We'll talk more about this later, but if there's no objective right and wrong, then might makes right, and that's a scary place to be in. Okay. On page 34, we have this beautiful picture of a castle. Yeah. I had a lot of fun with these notes on the iPad. You can just kind of scribble and, anyways. Why do I have this here? We're going to skip the castle. It's beautiful, but we're going to skip past it, okay? So let's talk about what's wrong with polytheism. In polytheism, as we've explained, you've got all sorts of gods running off in all sorts of directions. And so, as the person is looking at the world and trying to understand it, he sees behind the world all these different gods, and it doesn't make sense. And again, it's possible to have sort of a wisdom approach to the world. This works, this doesn't work. Ironically, the pre-modern system was a system of free thought. This is a system, often it works out to there is no free thought. Because this worked in the past, we don't know why it works, just shut up and do it the same way. And you have cultures that preserve traditions for generations and generations and generations because it works. We don't know why it works, and maybe it becomes enshrined in religion, maybe it's just this is how we've always done things. When God is on his throne, he created the world makes sense, we can try new things. Because we start to understand the underlying principles.
I'm not familiar with that word. Is there like what years were, like I'm...
Yeah, let's do years.
Yeah, like...
Okay, so which word are you not familiar with?
I don't know polytheism. I don't know really any of
You don't know polytheism? Oh, really? Okay. You guys need to help me because I've been in school, I've been in seminary for like forever. So polytheism, poly meaning more than one,
Okay.
and theism meaning God. This is opposed to monotheism, mono being one.
Okay.
So I need a pencil to, do you have, can I borrow this?
I think I slept through history.
I'm sure they did not teach this in history.
Oh, no?
know.
Okay.
Yeah, they didn't. Not in mine anyway.
Not mine either.
Actually, we haven't really got to any dates yet. But polytheism, yeah, many gods.
Okay.
So the Greeks believed in many gods. The Canaanites believed in many gods. Hindus today believe in many gods. And increasingly, postmoderns on the street are saying, well, there's many ways to God. So if you look to the practical conclusion of that, it's almost a polytheistic system. And then we had Platonism. Yay, Platonism! So let's talk about this, and I'm going to spend a bit more time on this because it's really important. We're on page 35, and it is new material, and I know this is new material, so hopefully I did a better job of presenting it. So around 450 BC.
Can you give us a year on polytheism?
No.
No, okay, you didn't want to.
No, I would put polytheism up to 450.
Okay.
It's kind of the default position of pretty much all of the ancient worldviews, except for Egypt for like 50 years. But pretty much everybody, and except for the Jews. So the Jews had a monotheistic system, but everybody else, it was polytheism in one way or another. Okay, so go ahead.
I'm just wondering, for a minute, putting myself into a polytheistic mindset and realizing what a catastrophic scary place that must be, because
it is
what you just said.
Yeah.
The idea that, okay, that worked once, and now any number of factors that I cannot possibly access or control or have any say into will impact upon me if I dare step out of this line.
Yeah.
I'm stuck here. Stuck. Yeah.
And yeah, that's very an astute observation. And most missionaries, as they go to other cultures, one of the main things they notice is the fear. Mm-hmm. And when the gospel comes, and part of that is explaining a different worldview and understanding, that God is good. He created the world is stable, it's orderly, it's knowable. The fear leaves because they start to understand themselves and understand the world around them. So Plato, what's the big deal with Plato? The way that this worked, I'll give you a bit of background here. You can, don't worry about memorizing names or places and things like that. But Socrates lived in 469 to 399, and he brought monotheism into Western thought, into Greek thought, because he believed in the idea of there being one God, and we could discuss whether his idea of God really counts as a God. It was a kind of a philosophical concept. But behind the whole world, there is one entity that created it. There's one God that created everything. And so, when he looks at the world, all of a sudden it makes sense. Oh. Because the God of Plato is a God of order and rationality, and he created a world that is separate from himself. And so we have God who created the world, and we're in the world. And so when we look at the world, we can say, well, why is it like that? God must have had a reason for making it like that. What was God's reason? And he would say, well, it was something in the mind of God. God has a perfect mind, a perfect way of looking at things, and it looks disorderly to us, but there must be order behind the disorder of the world. And Plato taught for a little while, then he was executed for being an atheist because because of the polytheism around him. But he had a very famous disciple named Plato, and we know of this system mostly through Plato. We kind of refer to it generally as Platonism. Socrates is the first one, and Socrates didn't actually write anything. There's some people that make a parallel between Socrates and Jesus, because Socrates didn't write anything, Jesus didn't write anything. Socrates' disciples made him famous, Jesus' disciples made him famous. Socrates died a heroic death, Jesus died a heroic death. Anyways, this is just kind of trivia information you might find interesting. But Plato took up his system, and he was able to provide huge insights into the world and into philosophy, and creating this system that worked and really laid the foundation for the Greek Golden Age, and then the Greco-Roman Golden Age that stretched from, almost 1,000 years, really. From from about 400 BC all the way up to the fall of Rome at 450 AD. So minus 400, so around 900 years. Tremendous insights. This is where they had the foundation of modern law. We have the foundation of modern medicine. We have the foundation of modern science. We have, you name it. Geometry came before, but it was really perfected in this time. All this stuff was possible because there was a one God behind this. There was a fixed point of reference that shows us how to understand the world. And so the world makes sense because God created it. Do I want to go into the difference between Plato and Aristotle? Probably not. Let's not do that.
To what extent would he have been aware of the monotheism of the Jewish nation?
Excellent question. It's open to debate. So liberal scholarship, and we'll talk about that in about 5 or 6 classes, would tend to say, well, Christianity just took Platonism and added it to Judaism. And so, or took Greek thought and added it to Judaism. The early church fathers, who were very influenced by Plato, said Plato got it from the Jews. The Jewish idea is older than Platonism, and there was interchange of ideas around the Mediterranean basin at that time. Plato, in his biography or autobiography, whatever, he talks about how he traveled the world looking for truth. He went to Egypt, he went around to Syria and different places. He would have come into contact with Judaism. And so the early church fathers said, no, he stole it from us. And the world, or liberal thinking would tend to say that Christianity stole it from them. It's kind of an open question because it's so stinking long ago, right? Like it's like almost 2,500 years. So we can't ask him where he got his ideas from. But that's a very good question. It's a very good question. I would tend to say, actually it doesn't really matter to me where Plato got his ideas from. But it is likely that Judaism was at least an option out there that he picked up. But he changed it in very significant ways. Platonism is not the same as Christianity, as we're going to look at in a second. Okay, before we move on from Platonism to pre-modernity, you can skip a page here. If you want, you can come back and look at this. There's a difference between Plato and Aristotle. Aristotle was the famous disciple of Plato. And he is the father of modern science, not Plato, because he had a different way of approaching philosophy in the world. I don't want to burn up brain cells right now because we have a limit of how much you guys can take. So we're just going to skip over that, but you can come back to that if you want. There's some lingering effects of Platonism that are still with us today. Okay? And here you have a little picture of, I need to erase some of my beautiful artwork here. So Plato says God is up here, the world is down here, and we are down here. And we need to somehow ascend up through reason to get up to God, right? So one of the consequences of this is for him, he said, rationality and thought are like divine or good or spiritual, but the body is bad. Fleshly desires, sexual temptations, appetites, good or bad, like positive or negative. The physical stuff is the bad stuff. Mental stuff is the good stuff, okay? Some of this was absorbed into, not the Bible, but into Christian thinking throughout the ages, and it's still with us today. Is sex bad? No, sex isn't bad. But especially throughout a long time during the Middle Ages, and even into the Reformation, even really, I mean, let's face it, in our lifetime, and this is changing now, but there is this feeling that sex is bad, physical is bad, it's bad to say that you're sad, it's bad to say that you're depressed, you should just be intellectual. And even our approach to the Bible is very intellectual, less emotionally engaged, less holistic. So this is a lingering effect of Platonism, that the way that we're rolling that back and finding renewal in the church is by rediscovering Judaism. And Judaism in many ways has been lost through the years. And Judaism doesn't divide the world between head and heart. It's a holistic approach to the world where you can be worshiping God and you can be very physically attracted to your wife. The two are not mutually exclusive. In fact, God created sex and he created the world. And so this is a major friction point between Platonism and Christianity. The two are not identical, even though they're similar. And another unfortunate consequence is that which gender is more rational, male or female? I'm not going to answer that, but Plato would say...
This is recorded.
An unfortunate consequence of Platonism, which you still get when you watch Star Trek The First Generation, and you got Spock, and he's very logical, and for some reason there's no females that are, well, I guess there were in his race, but anyways, males are seen to be more rational, therefore more spiritual, therefore closer to God. Women are carnal and weak and emotional, and so they're less spiritual. And this is another lingering effect of Platonism that we have in the church, right? Things like celibacy in the, thanks for that, I'll answer in a second. Celibacy in the Catholic Church, no sex, and men are, what it's all about. Although that is an overgeneralization. Elders in the church, now, I wouldn't react to Platonism to go all the way over to where our modern culture is, to say there's no such thing as gender, where we're completely equal. And I know there's difference in that. There's egalitarianism, there's feminism, there's complementarianism. That's a whole other thing. But I would say I'm a complementarian on gender issues because I believe in the Jewish understanding that there is femininity, there is masculinity. They're both made in the image of God, and together they complement one another. And I resist the contemporary push to erase gender. And I think that is the push. Okay, so we won't go there too much. I just want to say that this is Platonism, okay? Whenever you get the urge to throw a rock at somebody, just say Plato and throw something. And you'll appear very smart, especially on gender issues, because he is honestly to blame for a lot of this stuff, okay? The way that he saw the world, and he kind of got absorbed into Christianity. Okay, so the problem with where angels fear to tread. Okay, the problem with Platonism is that although it claims to have a fixed point of reference, there isn't really a fixed point of reference. Socrates thought that there were certain ideas that were just within a person, and if you asked enough questions, the truth would come out. That's why we have the Socratic method of just asking questions, and the truth kind of comes out. It's a teaching method. But
That's a very effective way to teach, actually.
it is very effective.
I've learned a lot through that.
Yeah, it takes more time.
Yeah.
It takes more preparation. I'm lazy. But it's a very effective way to teach.
Very effective.
So, the problem is there's certain things we all agree on, but very quickly after the three died, Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle, you have this whole diversity of other philosophers that say, well, actually, I see things just a little bit different. I see things just a little bit different. I see things just a little bit different. And then all of a sudden you have, well, this person over here, he sees the world this way because he sees God over here. And then you have this person, he sees the world differently because he sees God more like that. And this is on page 40 if you want a nice little picture. And so these people start debating with one another and say, well, no, that's not right. God isn't like that. He's like this. No, God isn't like that. He's like this. And pretty soon you realize we haven't really progressed at all. This is just polytheism. This is just your view versus my view. And this went on unnoticed for a long time because Plato and Aristotle's views were kind of held as the idea of God. By default. It was almost like there was revelation. I'm jumping ahead a little bit. But it was almost like, Plato has this divine revelation of who God is. But if you question that, and you're like, well, why is Plato's revelation any better than mine? Then pretty soon it's just like, well, we're back to your view versus my view. And so there was this golden age of Greek thought. We had this flourishing of science and intellect and things like that. But then it started to kind of crash and burn. And during the first century, there was a whole list of options out there. There was Neoplatonism, Gnosticism, Stoicism, Cynicism, mystery cults, and many more options. And there's definitions of that. Those are interesting for understanding the New Testament and early church history, all the different options that were out there. Some of these were more apparent after the New Testament was written. But anyways, it's all interesting stuff, if you like history. But the big idea is that we don't know anymore what's true. There's options. We don't know. And so after kind of rising up, Platonism is kind of crashing again because there's no fixed point of reference for science. There's no fixed point of reference for ethics. It's a little bit like Cornelius Van Til gave the illustration as a philosopher or somebody I like. Two philosophers were out fishing on the ocean, and one caught a huge fish. And the other guy said, this is a great fishing spot. We should mark it. And so the guy said, great, I'll leave my hat in the water here, and then we'll know where it is. The other guy said, that's silly. The water moves. And he said, let's write an X on the boat, and then we'll know where it is. If there's no fixed point of reference, then how do you progress? How do you have a meaningful dialogue about what is right and wrong? How do you have a meaningful dialogue about what is actually true? So then Christianity comes galloping on the scene, like a knight on a white horse. And it provides the picture that I gave you earlier about revelation. And it's actually good that I did that because it wasn't in the notes and it's actually super helpful. So what was the stumbling block? Paul talks about Jews seek for a sign and Greeks ask for wisdom. But we preach the gospel of Christ, which is foolishness to the Greeks and a stumbling block to Jews. What was the stumbling block? This is maybe a bonus question or something. Do you guys know what the stumbling block was between Christianity and it's in 1 Corinthians somewhere, 3 or something, 1 or 2. The stumbling block between Greek thought and Christianity or Judaism. There were a number of them, but...
Oh, it's in 125.
The identity of God.
The identity of God. The issue was God for Plato was unmoved, unchanging, and unchangeable. he served a function as far as he's up there and he's our fixed point of reference. But God for Plato, huge oversimplification, but he's a little bit like the number 3. The number 3 just is. He doesn't have a personality. Unless you're watching Sesame Street, but he doesn't do anything. He just is. And because he is, things make sense. He helps to explain the world, but he doesn't actually change anything. He doesn't jump down here to this icky, yucky world of flesh and do things. For one thing, that would be so revolting and completely backwards, because Platonism is all about ascending out of this yucky world of flesh up to the world of forms. So why would he do that? But secondly, how could he? And in John 1, the Word became flesh. And John 1 is actually a great apologetic passage, because he does the bridge. In the beginning was the Word, logos, great Greek concept. In the beginning was the Word. There's order, there's reason. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. Yes, God is rational. And in the beginning was the Word was with God, the Word was God. There was nothing that has been made that was not made by him. I'm paraphrasing a bit. So God, the Logos, creates the world. Yes, this is so Greek, this is so good. And the Greeks are all like, yeah. And then the Word became flesh.
And then he got crucified. What?
Yeah, exactly. And then he got crucified. The height of pain and suffering, physical weakness. And you can tell, by the way, which Gospels are aimed at Greeks and which ones are aimed more at Jews based on how it portrays Christ. They're all true, but the points that it'll draw out, and I forget which one it is, Luke would have been written more to a Greek audience, and I'm pretty sure it's that one that it doesn't mention Jesus suffering. I might have that wrong. Maybe it's Mark I'm thinking of. It just mentions he goes to the cross, he dies, and it's kind of a heroic presentation. And other Gospels that are aimed more at Jews and are connected with the suffering of the Jews and understanding more of how God engages with his people in suffering, chose to bring out more of the suffering part of God. But anyways, that's another issue. It's all just so fascinating. The stumbling block becomes the cornerstone. Because now, what do we have? What do we have now that the Word has become flesh? We have a fixed point of reference. We have revelation. We know who God is because he has revealed himself in Jesus Christ. And so in ethics, you're like, well, that's your view, this is my view. You think pedophilia is fine. I think it's wrong. Our views are equal. What would Jesus do? Sounds childish, but good ethics goes from a 3-year-old to a 99-year-old. Everybody gets that. Have a look at Jesus. Tell me if this guy would approve of pedophilia. No. I don't think so. In fact, I'm pretty sure he wouldn't. Yeah. The world is fluid. I have this view of the world. You have that view. It's always changing. Well, look at Jesus. He was what sort of a world would Jesus create? And have a look at the Old Testament and what does it say about God and the sort of God that God is. And then all of a sudden, the world makes sense. And then you have the 2 arrows of revelation. Now, because you understand special revelation, you can go to the world, you can study science, you can understand it. And so now we're back up to our arc of world thought. In the Middle Ages, yes, Rome fell. It sucked. Rome got destroyed at around 450 AD. It was kind of a long process of decline, and boom, it was done. And after, we'll talk about that next week, but when mega powers like that fall, the result is a dark age. There was a Bronze Age civilization. It fell. There was a dark age. Then the Iron Age picked it back up. So there was a fall, but Christianity was there to pick it up. And because Christianity was there, with this extremely useful method of looking at God and the world, we were able to build the Western civilization up to the point of, zooming ahead of all the rest of the world, absolutely outpacing by, like, I don't know how to express the difference between being able to build a steamship and having, having weapons versus other cultures that are still, pushing along gondolas and shooting bow and arrow. I mean, it's tremendous what Western civilization developed in 400 years. You might feel like 400 years is a long time. I mean, for a lot of cultures, especially its polytheistic cultures, they're just stuck. There's the wisdom increases. Yes, there's better books written on how to approach the world, but at the same time that can get backwards too. In 400 years or so, Western civilization just absolutely outpaced the others. And my argument is it's because of this way of approaching the world. Yeah?
By Western civilization, I'm assuming that includes Islamic civilization.
Very good question. It wouldn't include West Islam, but it should, because that's another monotheistic system.
Mm-hmm.
And so during the Dark Ages, the Middle Ages, whatever, for a while Islam was a stronger intellectual center than the West because they had more access to Plato and Aristotle, and it was a monotheistic system. It was like this, and they have revelation, so they have a fixed point of reference, so their system works as well. Based on the information I'm giving you, based on this criteria, Islam works just about as well as Christianity as far as having a fixed point of reference, having a point of contact for ethics and for science. I would, if we're going to have a longer debate, I would say, well, Christianity is superior than Islam for various reasons, but compared to the difference between Christianity and polytheism, they're very similar in that they have a fixed point of reference. And Judaism would be another one that has a fixed point of reference, monotheistic system with revelation. Okay, so we're going to talk about the nitty-gritty of history next week. But at around the year 1500, René Descartes comes along and he says, this is all fine and well to organize Western civilization with God at the top, but I would prefer not to have God at the top. Can we find something other than God to put up here? And there are a whole host of reasons for that, but his reasons were actually, he was an apologist and he was trying to prove that God exists, believe it or not. And so he said, well, we can't say, one, God exists, therefore science, and science proves God. That's circular, right? You got God as a premise and also a conclusion. And so he's saying we need to have a foundation for science other than God so that we can prove God objectively. Right? So this was his reasoning. And he said, I can doubt everything in the world. Think about the sensory perception. I mean, maybe I'm on drugs, maybe I'm, sick, maybe I'm imagining things. My sensory perception could be misleading me. And nowadays we have movies like Matrix, it could be a brain stuck in a jar of soup somewhere with aliens poking me and all this could be imaginary, whatever. So our sensory perception could be a lie, right? And he went through, I could doubt my friends, I could doubt, this table, I could doubt the sun. But at the end of the day, I sit there and I realize there's one thing that is constant, and that is there's somebody here doubting. And he thought, if I doubted everything and said nothing is real, I would realize I'd have to admit that I'm real. Otherwise, who would there be to doubt? And so this is where he came up with his famous phrase, which is cognito ergo sum. I think, therefore I am. Because he thinks and he doubts, he exists. And so he says, man, or humanity, or myself, is the fixed point of reference. And it seems to work. We just keep on going on with life as usual. We have the Industrial Revolution, the Scientific Revolution, we have the Industrial Revolution, we have all this wonderful stuff. Ethics continues. But is this a good fixed point of reference for the long term?
No.
Why not? Because we can let you down.
We're impressed.
We're unprofit.
It's too variable. So one person says, I mean, it gets back to the same problem with Platonism. So for ethics, you're just like, well, everybody knows that pedophilia is wrong. And somebody comes up and says, I don't believe that. So they have, this as their moral guide. And then somebody else says, well, I think this crazy thing is okay. And you're like, okay, how do we evaluate this? We're back to the biggest stick. We're back to there's no fixed point of reference. And all throughout, so René Descartes is the father of modern philosophy. We're into modernity now on our chart here. And there's all sorts of, the history of modern philosophy is the history of philosophers trying to make it work. And I don't want to say, well, it just doesn't work. I mean, there's almost 500 years of attempts to try and make it work, but ultimately it doesn't really work because there's no fixed point of reference.
It places you in the place of God.
It does, ultimately. But ultimately, how do you know that the world is real? Is the world really separate from you? If you're the fixed point of reference, if your perspective on the world is the most true thing, how do you, this is kind of maybe a big philosophical concept, but how do you separate yourself from your perception of the world? And how do you separate your perception of the world from the world? If there's a God that is a third party, so I'm observing the world, and the world exists and I exist because God sees both of us. And from his perspective, we're not moving. But from my perspective, when I observe something, how I see it, the perspective from which I see it, is very contextualized by who I am, by my experiences. And there's no way to separate myself from my experience. There's no bigger picture. There's no, if I can use a postmodern term, meta-narrative. There's lots of stories, but there's no big story to put it in, to make sense of it all. So you just have all these little stories. So then we get into the postmodernity. Yeah.
Where was René Descartes? Where is he from?
I believe.
His name would indicate that. I should know, but I don't.
Just popped out of where?
Yeah.
Somewhere in there. Anyway.
Interestingly enough, because there was such an interchange of ideas during this time, which was unheard of mostly in the world, it almost doesn't matter where he's from. He was from Europe.
Okay.
Although there are, differences between how people thought and tended to think in France or in England and stuff like that. So we have this picture of a castle, and all of Western society is built on.
A castle.
No.
Sorry.
The castle I skipped over earlier. We have certain presuppositions that are necessary for science. Let's see. Let's move all the way back to... Can you switch to 33 and 34? 33 first. There are certain things that we need to assume to make science work. Okay? And this is well established. This is it's a discipline. What is it? The philosophy of science. Is that right? Understanding how science works and what's necessary to make science work. There's certain things you need to believe to make science work, and there's a list of 10 here. I'm not going to do that, but just there's at least 4 things that have to work. The world needs to really exist. It can't be a myth, or it can't be an illusion, as in Buddhism. It has to be external to us. It can't be part of us. It needs to be orderly and it needs to be knowable. It needs to exist, has to be external to us, needs to be orderly and knowable. And all these things come naturally out of a Christian worldview. They make sense. If you think about a Christian worldview long enough, you'll be like, all these things make sense. If you take God out of the equation, is the world orderly? Why should the world be orderly if God didn't create it? In fact,
Everything else is chaotic.
In fact, if you talk to atheists, they're always going to increase the quotient of randomness in time, because for an atheist, there's an infinite sea of randomness, and there's so much randomness and so much time, finally it equals us, floating around on a sea of randomness. So if you have enough randomness in time, you'll have order. Now, put this idea in the driver's seat back at 600 AD. Would we have modern science?
No.
Let's look behind the world to look at more chaos. That's not a way to develop science, right? Getting a little bit ahead of myself. In fact, that was for like 5 lessons from now. Okay, let's get back to where we're going. The issue with modernity is there's no fixed point of reference. And so you have disagreements, and there's no way to ground your ethics. There's no way to ground your science. And so we end up stuck. And Western society, we have natural sciences, which are built on these presuppositions that the world is knowable, separate from us, rational, and understandable. All these presuppositions are the foundation, and because God exists, these things make sense. And then on top of that, we have natural sciences. Because these make sense, we can study nature. Because natural science makes sense, we can have applied science. Because applied science makes sense, we can have medicine, technology, all these sorts of things. Now the foundation, we just have question marks here. Because these foundational presuppositions no longer make sense. In language, words are symbols of the realities that we perceive. We all perceive reality a little bit differently. And so how can we have any shared understanding of what words actually mean if we perceive the reality differently? So this is a major philosophical issue. Many people are saying language doesn't make sense anymore. You can't speak, you can't communicate information anymore. History, can we really study history? Can we really know what happened? Well, all that we have are people writing their personal perspective on what happened. All their perspectives are influenced by their situation, by their worldview. What actually happened is gone. There's no way to actually get back to it, so history doesn't happen anymore. I've heard very serious academics say history doesn't exist. History is impossible. Ethics, without a fixed point of reference, as we've hammered on all throughout this course. Without a fixed point of reference, I took an iTunes U course, serious online course, forget if it was Stanford, Yale, Harvard, whatever. iTunes U, I'll talk about this later. Okay. You know what podcasts are? Mm-hmm. iTunes U is a division of the iTunes store that's only for accredited universities.
Really?
So you can take free content from all the great universities in the world.
Really? Oh.
Just listen to their stuff. Their lectures are out there.
Mary's going for it.
Yeah. So I've taken courses from Yale, Harvard, Stanford, and one of my history courses, first thing he said, my doctoral thesis is that history is impossible. And one of the ethics classes I took, one of the first things he said, ethics is impossible. Let's start there. Because there's no fixed point of reference. And natural sciences. This is kind of the last frontier. And natural sciences, they work. And as long as we don't question the presuppositions too much, it still works. The house is stable, just don't go in the basement. Or the closet, yeah. Just keep painting over the cracks in the walls. But there, even in science, there's what's it called? There's the understanding that when you observe something, you change it. And on a quantum level, this is a whole new thing that they're developing, is when you observe something, then you change it. If you go too far with that, you'll realize that's going to start unraveling the whole idea of science. Okay, so I meant to end 15 minutes earlier to have discussion. Let me conclude here, and then we'll have a little bit of discussion here. I used to be a card-carrying, T-shirt-wearing, blog-writing postmodern. Okay, and I was super proud of it. And at the time, it almost is becoming passé, but we call ourselves emergent, and we thought that was a really cool thing. Eventually, I realized, as much as the critiques of postmoderns towards modernity are true, It's true that the emperor has no clothes, that Descartes and his whole system that has been the foundation of Western thought for almost for 400 plus years, it doesn't work. And so postmodernity is the little boy in the corner saying, you have no clothes on. And it's true. Modernity does not work because there's no fixed point of reference. So as much as that's true, postmodernists don't have an answer. They're pointing out that there's a problem, but they don't know what to do about it. There's no way forward. And I wrote in my journal one day, postmodernity is not a way to live, it's a way to die.
Yeah.
Postmodernity is not a way to live, it's a way to die. Because what is life? Life is order. My cells are orderly and there's structure and they communicate with one another. And because they communicate and there's order, there's life.
Okay.
What happens when cells stop talking to each other and they're not organized anymore? Cancer, death. What happens when society stops talking to each other because language no longer functions? What happens when society stops engaging and creating meta-narratives and big stories of who we are as a people because language doesn't exist, because there's no fixed point of reference? We die, we descend, and the big word in postmodernity is deconstructionism. It's just taking deconstruct, the verb, and turning it into a noun. Deconstructing everything. And this is this is big in contemporary academics. I shouldn't say it's everything about contemporary academics, but am I right? You hear a lot about deconstructivism, deconstructing history, deconstructing ethics, deconstructing society, deconstructing the home. Because all these things were built on the foundation back in the Middle Ages, and we've been continuing with the same foundation, but at some point we realize this foundation doesn't make sense, or this system doesn't make sense without the foundation. And so my way forward is to go back. We need to go back to the last time things made sense, which was during the Middle Ages, during the Christian, what's something else? The Renaissance was the start of modernity and going a different direction, but the two ideas were at least present at the same time. So obviously, what we need to talk about next week is how dark were the Dark Ages actually? Because I'm making the claim that we need to go back there. And everybody in our society is like, what are you talking about? That is, like, by definition, a bad thing to do. You don't go back to the Dark Ages. But I want to make the claim that they weren't as dark as we think they are. And in fact, most of the misinformation about the Dark Ages was invented by later people kind of just throwing dirt on the time. Yeah. Comments and reflections?